What's the creepiest thing that society says is okay? Story 1. We've collectively agreed that fame voids basic human boundaries. That if someone is well known enough, it's suddenly acceptable to follow them, photograph their kids, speculate about their mental health, dissect their relationships, and monetize their worst moments. Not because they consented, but because someone will pay for it. And money quietly launders the ethics. What makes it unsettling is that we don't even frame it as stalking anymore. We call it coverage, news, public interest. As if visibility erases personhood. As if being recognized somehow turns a human life into a public utility. We wouldn't tolerate this behavior toward a stranger, but add fame and it becomes an industry. And the feedback loop is vicious. Paparazzi exist because outlets buy the content. Outlets buy it because audiences click. Audiences click because we're curious, bored, or want to feel close to people we'll never meet. Responsibility diffuses until no one feels accountable, and the harm just becomes background noise. The really dark part is how predictable the outcomes are. Burnout, paranoia, substance abuse. Public breakdowns are treated as entertainment. Then, retroactive sympathy once it's too late. We didn't know. The pressure was so intense, as if the system wasn't screaming its effects the entire time. It's one of those cultural practices that future generations are probably going to look at the way we look at freak shows or tabloid torture, not with confusion about what happened, but disbelief that it was ever considered normal. Story 2. We didn't slide into constant surveillance through tyranny. We slid into it through convenience. Maps that know where you are, phones that listen for wake words, cameras everywhere for safety, algorithms that remember you better than you remember yourself. None of it framed as control, all of it framed as service. And now we live in a world where it's considered normal that your movements, preferences, conversations, relationships, moods, and habits are continuously logged, inferred, stored, and sold. Governments say it's for security. Companies say it's for personalization. Both say, if you're not doing anything wrong, what's the problem? The problem is that privacy isn't about hiding wrongdoing. It's about having a space where your thoughts, mistakes, experiments, and growth aren't permanently recorded and judged. Surveillance doesn't just watch behavior, it shapes it. People self-censor, take fewer risks, avoid dissent, become more predictable, more manageable. What's unsettling is how little resistance there is. Not because people are stupid, but because opting out increasingly means opting out of modern life itself. Try functioning without a phone, without apps, without accounts. The cost of privacy keeps rising until only the privileged can afford it. And the scariest part isn't what's being done with the data now. It's that data doesn't expire. Regimes change. Incentives shift. Tools built for convenience don't stay neutral forever. Story 3. Across cultures, systems, and time periods, people with disabilities or chronic illnesses get treated like they're lesser versions of humans instead of humans with different needs. Less credible, less valuable, less worthy of patience, dignity, autonomy, or joy. Even when no one says it out loud, it shows up in policies, infrastructure, medicine, employment, and everyday social interactions. What's especially cruel is how conditional acceptance often is. You're tolerated as long as you're inspiring, quiet, productive, grateful, or not too inconvenient. The moment you need accommodation, rest, flexibility, or understanding, the tone shifts. Suddenly, you're a burden, a cost, a problem to be managed. And chronic illness is even worse because it refuses to be visible or linear. If you don't look sick, you must be exaggerating. If you are sick for too long, people get tired of believing you. It's not just ignorance, it's fear. Disability reminds able-bodied people that bodies are fragile, that control is temporary, that productivity isn't guaranteed. Rather than sit with that discomfort, societies push disabled people to the margins and pretend it's fairness or efficiency. What makes it universal is that it's baked into how we define normal. The world is built for a narrow slice of humanity, and everyone else is treated like a deviation instead of part of the spectrum. Future generations are going to look back at this the same way we look at other forms of dehumanization, not with confusion, but with shame. Not how didn't they know, but how did they justify it for so long? Disabled people aren't asking for special treatment. They're asking to be treated like full humans in a world that keeps forgetting they exist. And the fact that this still needs to be said is the indictment. Story 4. We're incredibly quick to pathologize differences, especially cognitive differences. The moment someone expresses an idea that doesn't fit shared assumptions, dominant narratives, or social comfort, the label comes out: delusional, unstable, psychotic. Not because the idea has been carefully examined and found incoherent, but because it's unfamiliar, unsettling, or inconvenient. The problem is that uncommon gets treated as unwell when those are completely different things. History is full of ideas that were once fringe, ridiculed, or dismissed as madness before becoming accepted, refined, or at least taken seriously. But instead of engaging with ideas on their structure, evidence, or implications, we often short-circuit straight to diagnosing the person who said them. What makes this especially cruel is how it intersects with real mental illness. People who do experience psychosis or other conditions already struggle to be taken seriously. When we flatten all unconventional thinking into pathology, we don't protect anyone, we just silence people. It becomes a way to avoid uncomfortable conversations by turning them into medical problems. And there's a power dynamic baked in. Labeling someone as mentally ill doesn't just critique their idea. It undermines their credibility, autonomy, and agency. It says, you don't need to be argued with. You need to be managed. That's not care. That's control dressed up as concern. Mental illness is real. Psychosis is real. But so is intellectual diversity, creativity, and the human tendency to explore weird corners of thought. Treating those as the same thing doesn't help anyone. A society that can't tolerate strange ideas without medicalizing them isn't protecting mental health. It's protecting consensus. And consensus has never been the same thing as truth. Story 5. At its core, interest assumes the future will always be bigger than the present. More growth, more resources, more productivity, forever. Money today magically turns into more money tomorrow just because time passed. And we've built entire global systems on that assumption, even though we live on a finite rock with finite materials and finite energy. What makes it extra weird is how abstract it is. Nothing physical is being created by interest itself. No food, no shelter, no labor, just numbers demanding to increase. And if they don't, someone loses a home, a country collapses, a crisis happens. Reality bends to satisfy the math we invented. Prices rising forever is the same delusion. Inflation is normal, markets expect growth, returns must increase. Okay, but where is that growth supposed to come from once you zoom out far enough? You can only squeeze efficiency, labor, and nature so much before the bill comes due. Interest turns time into a weapon. If you already have capital, time works for you. If you don't, time works against you. The longer you exist without wealth, the more expensive existence becomes, and we treat that as morally neutral, like gravity, instead of a choice we keep reinforcing. The wild part is that questioning interest gets framed as naive or radical, even though it's basically asking, why are we structuring society around infinite growth in a finite system? It's one of those ideas that only feels normal because it's everywhere. Step outside it for a second and it starts looking less like economics and more like collective magical thinking. Story 6. We've basically built a world where softcore stalking is treated as curiosity. Refreshing an ex's page, deep scrolling a partner's likes, checking who watched whose story, cross-referencing timestamps and follows like it's a crime board. And instead of asking why are we doing this to ourselves, we added incognito mode so you can do it quietly and pretend it's fine. That's the sketchy part. Not just that people look, but that the platforms expect you to look, obsess, compare, and monitor. They design for it. They profit from it. They give you just enough access to fuel anxiety without enough context to resolve it. So your brain fills in the gaps with paranoia, insecurity, and imagined narratives. And then we moralize it individually. If you have nothing to hide, it's just curiosity. Everyone does it. But if someone followed you around in real life the way people follow each other online, we'd call it creepy immediately. Digital distance just anesthetizes the behavior. Incognito mode is the tell. It's an admission that people know this isn't healthy, but instead of changing the behavior, we hide it better. Surveillance without accountability, curiosity without consent. It's not that people suddenly became sketchy. It's that we built tools that blur boundaries, reward suspicion, and make privacy feel optional. Story 7. We basically gave people the ability to heckle, harass, humiliate, and dogpile others 24/7, at scale, often anonymously, and then acted shocked when it broke people. There's no going home from it. No physical boundary, no cooldown. Your bedroom, your phone, your safe space, all fair game. And the audience is potentially infinite. What makes it especially cruel is the asymmetry. One person gets targeted, but the abuse comes from dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who don't see themselves as responsible because they're just one comment. The harm gets distributed, so no one feels accountable, but the impact is concentrated entirely on the victim. And then there's the gaslighting. Just log off, ignore it, don't read the comments. As if the problem is the person being hurt, not the environment designed to amplify cruelty, reward outrage, and turn real humans into abstract avatars. As if social connection wasn't a basic human need we're wired to seek. What's wild is how normalized it is. People treat public shaming and harassment as entertainment, activism, or deserved punishment. The line between accountability and cruelty gets blurry fast. And once someone is labeled acceptable to hate, empathy evaporates. Future generations are probably going to look back at this era and be horrified that we handed adolescents, and honestly everyone, tools this powerful with zero guardrails and called it free expression. Cyberbullying isn't just mean behavior. It's what happens when technology outpaces our ethics and we pretend that distance erases responsibility. And it hasn't yet occurred to us, collectively, how much damage that's already done. Story 8, we treat money like it's a neutral tool, but where it flows tells you exactly what a society prioritizes. Infinite funding for war, surveillance, bailouts, and vanity projects. But suddenly there's no budget for healthcare, education, infrastructure, disability support, or long-term solutions. Somehow there's always money for things that maintain power, and never enough for things that maintain people. What really breaks your brain is that money is imaginary. It's numbers in databases, agreed upon symbols. We literally invent it. And yet we let those symbols dictate who lives comfortably, who suffers, and who dies early. Entire systems grind people down not because resources don't exist, but because the accounting says they're not profitable. Then there's the personal side. People drowning in debt for basic survival while others hoard more wealth than they could ever meaningfully use. Money stops being a means of exchange and turns into a scoreboard, a shield, a weapon. Accumulation for its own sake, detached from any real human outcome. And when things go wrong, the narrative is always individual failure, bad choices, laziness, poor planning, never systemic design, never the fact that we built an economy that rewards extraction over care and speed over sustainability. Story 9. One of the creepiest things society is just okay with is the sheer level of surveillance and data collection by corporations and governments. Most people willingly carry around devices that track their location, record their conversations, and build detailed psychological profiles based on their behaviors, interests, and weaknesses, all for the sake of convenience gross. Facial recognition, biometric data storage, and AI-driven profiling have been normalized, despite their massive potential for abuse. The unsettling part? Most people either don't realize the extent of it or have become so desensitized that they just shrug it off as the cost of modern life. Story 10. On paper, it's framed as choice, competition, innovation. In practice, it's a maze designed to exhaust people when they're at their most vulnerable. Coverage tied to employment, insurance networks that change without warning, treatments denied by algorithms, doctors fighting paperwork instead of disease. You don't just get sick, you get processed. What makes it especially brutal is the inversion of responsibility. Illness is treated like a personal failure, but access to care is treated like a luxury. You can do everything right and still end up bankrupt from an accident, a diagnosis, or bad luck. The question isn't, what care do you need, but what can we get away with not paying for? Insurance, which is supposed to reduce risk, ends up amplifying it. You pay constantly and still hesitate to see a doctor because of copays, deductibles, surprise bills, or fear of denial. Preventive care gets delayed, problems get worse, costs go up. Then the system blames patients for being expensive. The really surreal part is that this is normalized. People defend it like it's inevitable or uniquely complex, even though other countries figured out workable alternatives decades ago. We have the resources, the technology, the expertise, just not the political will to prioritize health over profit. Story 11. We've normalized a world where a tiny number of people accumulate more wealth than they could ever meaningfully use, while millions spend most of their waking lives doing work they don't care about, under constant stress, just to survive. And we call that the economy, as if it's a force of nature instead of a set of choices we keep reinforcing. What's especially unsettling is how thoroughly it's been internalized. People don't just accept the imbalance, they identify with it. Hustle culture, grind, that's just how life is. The idea that your time, energy, and attention are things you're supposed to sell away in bulk, often for goals you didn't choose, becomes so normal it stops feeling like a trade at all. It just feels like adulthood. Extreme inequality isn't an accident of the system, it's a feature. The system requires people to feel replaceable, tired, and slightly afraid. That pressure keeps things running. And the people at the top aren't just wealthier, they're insulated from the consequences of the structure they benefit from. Time, comfort, and choice become luxuries, while everyone else is told to be grateful for stability they barely have. The really dark part is how little imagination we're allowed. Any alternative gets dismissed as naive, unrealistic, or dangerous, even though what we're doing now is clearly unsustainable, psychologically, socially, environmentally. We've made "this is normal" do an enormous amount of moral work. Future humans are probably going to look back and ask why we accepted a system where so many people's lives were treated as fuel for numbers on a screen. Story 12. Hatred has somehow become socially legible, even respectable. As long as it's aimed in the right direction, it's treated as normal, rational, even virtuous. We don't just tolerate it, we expect it. We build identities around it. We bond over it. We reward it with attention, applause, and power. What's strange is that hatred is almost never about the person or group it's aimed at. It's about fear, loss of control, humiliation, scarcity, or the need to simplify a world that feels overwhelming. Hatred gives you a target. It turns complexity into a shape you can punch. And that feels relieving, even if it corrodes everything it touches. Societies accept widespread hatred because it's useful. It mobilizes people. It distracts them from structural problems. It creates in-groups and out-groups which are easier to manage than a population asking hard questions. Hatred feels active, like doing something, even when it's just emotional stagnation wearing armor. What's especially bleak is how early it gets normalized. Kids aren't born hating. They learn who it's okay to despise. Which jokes get laughs. Which cruelties get justified. Which people are safe to dehumanize. By the time we're adults, hatred often feels less like a choice and more like part of the atmosphere. And yet, hatred doesn't actually solve anything. It doesn't heal wounds. It doesn't bring justice. It doesn't make people safer in the long run. It just burns energy and leaves behind ash, while convincing the person holding it that they're strong. Story 13, US. Prisons aren't designed around rehabilitation, safety, or even basic human dignity. They're designed around punishment, control, and cost-cutting. Overcrowding, inadequate medical care, spoiled food, extreme heat or cold, violence as a daily background threat, solitary confinement that borders on psychological torture. These aren't rare abuses, they're routine conditions. What makes it especially bleak is how normalized it is. We've collectively decided that once someone is labeled criminal, almost anything done to them is acceptable. Not because it makes society safer, but because it satisfies a moral itch. They deserve it. That idea shuts down empathy and excuses cruelty in advance. The reality is that most incarcerated people are there for nonviolent offenses. Many are mentally ill, addicted, poor, or victims of circumstances they never had the tools to escape. And even for those who did commit serious harm, the conditions they're subjected to don't undo that harm. They multiply it. Trauma goes in, trauma comes out. Then we act surprised when recidivism is high. There's also a racial and economic layer that's impossible to ignore. Who gets imprisoned, how long, and under what conditions isn't evenly distributed. Prison becomes a warehouse for people. Society failed and then blamed for failing. What's truly damning is that we know better. Other countries run prisons that are safer, more humane, and far more effective at reducing reoffending. This isn't ignorance, it's a choice. Story 14. Oversharing children's lives on social media is often framed as harmless, proud parents, cute moments, memories saved. But in practice, it turns childhood into content and privacy into an afterthought. Kids don't get a say. Their faces, habits, locations, fears, meltdowns, and milestones are posted permanently, long before they understand what that permanence means. What makes it unsettling is how normalized it's become. A tantrum isn't a moment to protect anymore. A vulnerable confession isn't private, it's engagement. Parents talk about sharing joy, but the incentives are obvious. Likes, validation, sometimes money. The child becomes a supporting character in someone else's online identity. There's also a power imbalance no one likes to acknowledge. Children can't consent in any meaningful way, and even if they say yes, they don't grasp the long-term consequence. That embarrassing video, that medical detail, that emotional breakdown, it doesn't disappear when they grow up. It follows them into school, into friendships, into adulthood. Digital footprints aren't abstract when they're built for you before you can speak. Then there's the safety angle, which gets brushed off as paranoia until it isn't. Oversharing exposes patterns, locations, routines, and personal information to strangers. It's not just about worst-case scenarios. It's about unnecessary risk, layered onto someone who depends entirely on adults for protection. At its core, this isn't about technology, it's about boundaries. We've decided that because parents own the accounts, they also own the story. But children aren't content libraries or brand extensions. They're people who deserve the same dignity we expect for ourselves, especially when they're too young to demand it. Story 15. People who repeatedly violate their pet's boundaries and then act shocked when the animal becomes reactive aren't dealing with a mystery, they're dealing with consequence. Pulling ears, hugging when the animal is trying to escape, looming over them, ignoring warning signals, these aren't signs of affection to the animal. They're stressors. What makes it worse is how often the warning signs are dismissed. Growling is labeled bad behavior. Stiff posture is ignored. Turning away, freezing, lip licking, signals meant to prevent escalation, are brushed off until the animal has no option left but to snap. Then the narrative flips. The pet is aggressive, unpredictable, dangerous. The human behavior that led there vanishes from the story. There's a deep entitlement at play. Because animals can't speak, people assume consent where none was given. They treat tolerance as permission and submission as trust. But animals don't owe humans unlimited access to their bodies, their space, or their patience. When those boundaries are repeatedly crossed, fear replaces trust. That's not a temperament flaw, it's conditioning. Story 16. Pressuring people to smile or be friendly is usually framed as harmless social glue, just politeness, just good vibes. But underneath it is a demand for emotional compliance. It says your internal state matters less than how comfortable you make everyone else. What makes it especially grating is how unevenly it's enforced. Certain people are expected to be warm on command, approachable at all times, pleasant no matter what they're carrying. Fatigue, grief, anxiety, focus. None of it counts. If your face isn't performing the right emotion, you're treated as a problem. There's also a control element that gets brushed off as manners. Smiling is framed as a choice, but it's rarely offered as one. It's a correction, a reminder to adjust yourself to fit the room. And when someone resists, they're labeled rude, cold, difficult, as if neutrality itself is a moral failing. The irony is that forced friendliness doesn't create genuine connection. It produces a thin, artificial version of it, one that prioritizes comfort over honesty. Real warmth can't be commanded. It has to be voluntary. At its core, this isn't about kindness. It's about entitlement. The belief that others owe you emotional accessibility, and the quiet insistence that if they don't provide it, something is wrong with them, not the expectation. Story 17. People in relationships spying on each other's phones or tracking each other's location often justify it as concern, transparency, or having nothing to hide. But when surveillance replaces trust, the relationship has already shifted into something else. Care doesn't require constant access. Security doesn't come from monitoring. What makes it especially corrosive is how normalized it's become. Location sharing is framed as cute, phone checks are framed as reassurance, boundaries are reframed as red flags. If you hesitate, you're accused of secrecy, as if privacy and betrayal are the same thing. There's a quiet erosion that happens here. Intimacy stops being chosen and starts being enforced. Instead of trust, there's verification. Instead of communication, there's evidence gathering. The relationship becomes a low-level investigation where one person is always on trial, even when nothing is wrong. And the irony is that this behavior doesn't prevent dishonesty. It amplifies insecurity. Every delayed reply, every unexplained movement, every locked app becomes fuel. Surveillance doesn't calm anxiety, it feeds it. The need to know more only grows. At its core, this isn't about love or loyalty. It's about control and fear, dressed up as closeness. Healthy relationships leave room for autonomy. When that space disappears, what's left isn't intimacy, it's containment. Story 18. I've never been a fan of hunting, especially when it's done for trophies instead of food. Ending an animal for sustenance at least fits into a coherent moral framework: necessity, responsibility, use. Trophy hunting strips that away and leaves behind domination as the point. What makes it particularly unsettling is how it's reframed as tradition or conservation. The language softens the act, but the reality is blunt. An animal is ended so its body, or parts of it, can be displayed as proof of conquest. Life itself is secondary to symbolism. There's also a distance built into it. The animal isn't encountered as a living being with its own instincts and struggles, but as an object to be won. The photograph matters more than the ecosystem. The bragging rights outlast any practical value. That disconnect is the feature, not the flaw. Defenders often argue legality or regulation, as if permission answers the ethical question. But legality doesn't equal justification. You can follow every rule and still be doing something empty, cruel, or unnecessary. At its core, trophy hunting isn't about survival or stewardship. It's about power, about proving you can take life and turn it into decor. And that's a motivation that's hard to dress up as anything else. Story 19. Self-centeredness isn't just about vanity or ego, it's about selective blindness. Most people don't see themselves as harmful. They just get very comfortable minimizing the damage their actions cause, as long as they're the ones benefiting. What makes it so pervasive is how easy it is to justify. The harm is indirect. The consequences are delayed. The affected people are abstract, so it becomes simple to shrug and move on. If acknowledging the damage would require changing behavior, the damage is suddenly debatable. There's also a cultural reward system built around this. We praise efficiency over care, success over ethics, winning over impact. If you're doing well, you're assumed to be doing something right. Anyone pointing out the collateral damage is labeled bitter, dramatic, or unrealistic. Most of the time, this isn't fueled by cruelty, it's fueled by convenience. Looking closely at who pays the cost of your comfort is uncomfortable. It threatens the story you tell yourself about being a good person. So the easier option is indifference, wrapped in rationalization. At its core, self-centeredness isn't loud or cartoonish, it's quiet. It shows up in small decisions, repeated daily, where empathy loses to self-interest, and no one feels responsible because everyone does it. Story 20. Commenting on someone's body, whether framed as praise or criticism, is often treated as harmless social interaction. A compliment here, a joke there. But it assumes entitlement to evaluate a body that isn't yours, as if existing in public automatically invites assessment. What makes the positive comments slippery is how quickly they turn conditional. You look good, implying you could look bad. You've lost weight, implying that who you were before needed fixing. Even approval reinforces the idea that bodies are up for scoring, that worth is tied to appearance in ways people are expected to accept gratefully. Negative comments are more obvious in their harm, but they operate on the same logic. They reduce a person to a physical trait and treat that reduction as fair game. Context, health, history, and consent don't factor in. The commenter gets a moment of expression, the recipient gets a lingering echo. There's also a power dynamic that's easy to ignore. Some people are far more likely to have their bodies remarked on, scrutinized, or noticed. And opting out isn't really an option. Silence is read as politeness. Discomfort is reframed as oversensitivity. At its core, this isn't about honesty or kindness. It's about control, the quiet assumption that other people's bodies exist for commentary. And the simplest boundary is also the most ignored. If it's not necessary, not invited, and not about something that can change without harm, it doesn't need to be said. Story 21. The irrational side of advertising and marketing isn't a flaw, it's the point. It's not designed to help people make informed, rational decisions about products or services. It's designed to bypass reasoning altogether and trigger impulse, insecurity, fear of missing out, or status anxiety. The mistake isn't accidental, it's engineered. What makes it especially insidious is how accepted it is. If a government used the same psychological tactics to shape behavior, we'd call it propaganda and treat it as a moral threat. But when corporations do it, it's reframed as creativity, branding, or just business. The intent is the same: influence without transparency. Only the beneficiary changes. Most advertising doesn't argue that a product is better. It implies that you are lacking without it. You're behind. You're missing out. You're not attractive enough, productive enough, happy enough. The product becomes the solution to a problem the ad just invented. That's not persuasion, it's manipulation dressed up as. Story 22. Recording and photographing every moment as if it's meant for the internet turns lived experience into raw material. Moments stop being something you're in and start being something you're capturing. Presence gets traded for proof. What makes it especially hollow is how reflexive it's become. A concert, a meal, a conversation, a crisis. Phone out first, processing later. The question isn't, is this meaningful? But is this shareable? Memory gets outsourced to an algorithm, and validation becomes the metric that decides what mattered. There's also a quiet distortion happening in real time. When everything is potentially content, behavior shifts. People perform their own lives, curate reactions, flatten complexity into something that reads well on a feed. Private moments lose their privacy not because they aren't valuable, but because visibility is treated as value. And the costs are rarely acknowledged. Constant documentation fractures attention, erodes intimacy, and blurs consent, especially when other people are pulled into posts they didn't agree to be part of. The internet doesn't forget, but it does move on, leaving consequences behind while the audience scrolls. At its core, this isn't about nostalgia or sharing joy. It's about compulsion, the need to externalize experience to feel that it counted. But a moment doesn't need witnesses to be real, and not everything meaningful is meant to be archived, optimized, and consumed. Story 23. This is going to sound insane, but bear with me. The concept of tipping is ridiculous to me, and before people get upset, I feel like I shouldn't have to tip someone for doing their job. Why is the burden put on me to cover their wages when they are employed by a large company whose CEO's salary is 10 times mine? The only situation I'd tip is if they went beyond their normal duties. Like if I ask a delivery man to carry my washing machine to the second floor, I'd give him a tip, because he didn't have to do that, but taking my order and refilling my drink shouldn't require a tip. I know people are going to say servers can't survive with what they get paid, but that's an issue between them and their employers, not me, the average Joe. Story 24. Instagram profiles packed with hundreds of nearly identical photos, same person, same angles, same expressions, start to feel less like self-expression and more like a loop. Not a story, not a moment in time, just repetition. A single message hammered endlessly. Look at me. What makes it so stark is the absence of context. No events, no relationships, no sense of life unfolding, just the self isolated and curated, presented again and again for appraisal. The feed becomes a mirror held up to strangers. waiting for confirmation that the image still works. There's a quiet desperation baked into the repetition. If one photo didn't land hard enough, maybe the next will. Or the next. The poses change slightly, the outfits rotate, but the underlying question stays the same. Am I seen yet? The platform doesn't discourage this, it rewards it. Attention becomes currency, and sameness becomes efficient. What's uncomfortable isn't vanity itself, it's the narrowing. Identity collapses into appearance. The person becomes a brand with one product. Anything that doesn't fit the aesthetic gets edited out, until the feed feels less like a life and more like an ad stuck on repeat. At its core, this isn't confidence. It's dependent. When self-worth is propped up by constant visual affirmation, silence feels like erasure. And the endless "look at me" isn't arrogance. It's what happens when being looked at starts to feel like the only proof that you exist. Story 25, shaking hands is treated as a neutral social ritual, but it's not. It's enforced intimacy. Physical contact on demand, often with strangers, regardless of comfort, health, culture, or context. Declining it reads as rude, suspicious, or antisocial, even when there are perfectly valid reasons to not want someone else's hand in yours. What makes it especially outdated is how little sense it makes. It spreads germs, ignores boundaries, and privileges extroversion and physical ease. Yet it persists because tradition is mistaken for necessity. We don't ask why we do it, we just penalize people who don't. Contrast that with bowing cultures, like in Japan, where respect is expressed without invasion of personal space, or gestures like a hand over the heart with a nod, common in places like Iran, acknowledgement without contact, courtesy without assumption. The respect is symbolic, not physical, and consent is built in. Handshakes collapse all of that nuance. They assume comfort, health, and willingness. They flatten greetings into a single default and treat deviation as a character flaw. The irony is that they're supposed to signal respect, yet they begin by overriding it. At its core, this isn't about hating tradition. It's about recognizing that social rituals should evolve toward less coercion, not more. A bow, a nod, a hand to the heart. Respect doesn't require touch, and insisting that it does says more about habit than manners. Story 26. Asking AI for everything instead of doing any research yourself feels efficient, but it quietly erodes something important. Curiosity gets outsourced. Effort gets skipped. The process of struggling with a question, of digging, cross-checking, sitting with uncertainty, gets replaced with instant answers on demand. What makes it especially concerning is how invisible the trade-off is. AI sounds confident. It responds immediately. So it creates the illusion of understanding without the work that actually builds it. Information arrives fully formed, detached from sources, context, or the friction that teaches you how knowledge is constructed in the first place. There's also a dependency forming that people rarely acknowledge. When every question is answered for you, you stop learning how to ask better ones. You don't develop judgment about what's reliable, what's incomplete, or what needs skepticism. The tool becomes an authority instead of a starting point. This is especially risky for younger people. If you grow up treating AI as an oracle rather than an assistant, you never build the muscles for research, patience, or critical thinking. You learn what to think before you learn how to think. And when the answers are wrong, biased, or shallow, as they sometimes are, you don't have the framework to notice. At its core, this isn't an argument against AI, it's an argument against intellectual laziness disguised as productivity. Tools are supposed to extend human thinking, not replace it. When curiosity turns into prompt dependence, the cost isn't just misinformation, it's the slow loss of independent thought. Story 27. Talking to someone while keeping their headphones on is a small thing that signals something bigger. Divided attention being treated as good enough. The conversation is technically happening, but presence isn't. You're getting whatever focus leaks through the audio instead of the respect of being fully engaged with. What makes it especially irritating is how normalized it is. People act like pausing a song or removing an earbud is an unreasonable task, as if acknowledging another human for a moment is an inconvenience. The message, intended or not, is clear. Something else has priority, and you're interrupting it. There's also a subtle power dynamic at play. One person is open, unfiltered, available. The other is buffered, half elsewhere, protected from full engagement. It turns a basic interaction into an imbalance where one side has to work harder just to be heard. Defenders frame it as efficiency or multitasking, but real listening doesn't work that way. Attention is not infinitely divisible. When it's split, understanding gets thinner and connection becomes transactional. At its core, this isn't about headphones. It's about courtesy. Removing them is a small, deliberate act that says, "You have my attention." Refusing to do it says the opposite. And people feel that immediately, even if no one names it out loud. Story 28. Lying directly to someone's face to protect their feelings is usually framed as kindness, but more often it's avoidance. It prioritizes short-term comfort over respect, and it assumes the other person is too fragile to handle reality. What makes it especially corrosive is how self-serving it can be. The lie doesn't just spare their feelings, it spares the liar from discomfort, conflict, or accountability. Honesty gets reframed as cruelty, while deception gets a moral pass as empathy. There's also a quiet condescension baked into it. Deciding what someone can or can't handle puts you in a position of authority over their emotional life. It denies them agency, the right to respond to the truth in their own way, even if that response is messy or painful. And the fallout doesn't disappear just because the lie was well-intentioned. People sense inconsistency. They build decisions on false information. When the truth eventually surfaces, as it usually does, the damage is worse, because now it's paired with betrayal. At its core, protecting someone's feelings by lying to them isn't kindness. It's control dressed up as care. Real compassion trusts people with the truth and respects them enough to let them decide what to do with it. Story 29. Casual gossip and bad-mouthing are usually dismissed as harmless social bonding, just venting, just curiosity, just filling silence. But at its core, it's a fixation on other people's private lives that masquerades as connection. The information isn't shared to help anyone. It's shared to be held, displayed, and passed along. What makes it especially unsettling is how eager people are for it. Details about coworkers, friends, strangers, anything personal becomes currency. The more intimate or damaging, the more valuable it is. Listening becomes participation, and silence is treated like consent. Some people seem drawn to it compulsively, as if their own inner lives aren't enough to occupy them. Talking about others becomes a way to avoid introspection. It's easier to analyze someone else's flaws, mistakes, or drama than to sit with your own. And there's a particular burden on people who, like you, give off a safe listener energy. People unload secrets, confessions, and private grievances without always considering the weight they're placing on you, or whether you agreed to carry it. Being trusted doesn't automatically mean wanting to be recruited into someone else's ethical mess. At its core, gossip isn't about information. It's about power, knowing something someone else doesn't, shaping narratives without the subject present, feeling relevant through access. And the cost is trust, slowly eroded, one harmless comment at a time. Story 30, relying on machines to raise kids, handing a toddler an iPad and calling it stimulation, is often justified as modern parenting or a necessary break. But in reality, it's displacement. A screen steps in where interaction, patience, and presence are supposed to be doing the work. What makes it especially damaging is how early it starts. A developing brain wired for movement, language, frustration, and social feedback gets flooded instead with hyper-stimulating visuals and endless dopamine loops. Watching Cocomelon on repeat for hours isn't neutral background noise. It's conditioning. Attention spans shrink. Emotional regulation weakens. Silence becomes intolerable. It's also sold as educational, which gives it cover. Bright colors, cheerful songs, simple words. So it feels productive. But learning isn't passive absorption. Toddlers don't learn to speak, cope, or think by staring at a screen. They learn through back and forth, boredom, trial, failure, and human response. Screens shortcut all of that. There's an uncomfortable truth underneath. Devices are often used less to help children and more to manage adults. They keep kids quiet, still, contained. They buy peace. But that peace is borrowed, and the interest shows up later. In classrooms, in behavior, in the inability to self-soothe without external stimulation. At its core, this isn't about technology being evil. It's about neglect being normalized because it's convenient. Kids don't need constant entertainment. They need engagement, limits, and real human attention. Outsourcing that to a machine doesn't just fill time. It shapes a nervous system. And that's not something you get to undo later. Story 31. Armchair diagnosing people, especially when it comes to mental health, has become a casual pastime dressed up as awareness. Someone shows a trait, a mood, a coping behavior, and suddenly strangers are handing out diagnoses like labels. What should be approached with care gets flattened into speculation. What makes it particularly harmful is the confidence it's delivered with. People speak as if observation equals understanding, as if watching fragments of someone's life gives them authority over that person's inner reality. Symptoms are complex, contextual, and deeply personal. Stripped of that context, they turn into stereotypes. There's also a strange moral posturing involved. Diagnosing others can feel compassionate, I'm just trying to explain them, but it often does the opposite. It reduces people to disorders they may not have, dismisses their agency, and reframes legitimate emotions as pathology. Sadness becomes depression. Orcs become disorders. Discomfort becomes diagnosis. For mental health especially, this kind of speculation can be destabilizing. It plants doubt. It pressures people to identify with labels they didn't choose or haven't explored with professionals. And when the guess is wrong, it doesn't just miss the mark, it can delay real understanding and real help. At its core, armchair diagnosis is a boundary violation. You don't get to define someone's suffering from the outside. You don't get to tell people what they are or aren't experiencing just because it fits a narrative you recognize. Empathy doesn't require naming. Sometimes the most respectful response is simply believing people when they describe their own lives and knowing when to stay out of it. Story 32. When people randomly interrupt a conversation you're already in just to launch into an unrelated monologue, it's less social awkwardness and more disregard. It treats other people's time and attention as public property, something you can just step into without invitation. What makes it especially jarring is the assumption underneath it. No introduction, no reading of the room, no acknowledgement that you were already mid-exchange. Just a hard pivot into whatever is occupying their mind, as if everyone nearby has been cast as a captive audience. Royal family conspiracies, personal theories, unsolicited opinions, content without consent. There's a kind of NPC energy to it, but not in a funny way. It's dialogue triggered by proximity, not connection. You're not being spoken with, you're being spoken at. And the social cues that normally regulate interaction, eye contact between friends, body language, pauses, are completely ignored. It also puts you in an unfair position. Cutting them off feels rude, even though the interruption itself was the breach. Though you're left politely absorbing someone else's stream of consciousness, while your own conversation dissolves in the background. At its core, this isn't about eccentric interests or poor timing, it's about entitlement to attention. Conversation is a shared space, not an open mic. And barging into it without invitation doesn't make you interesting, it just makes you intrusive. Story 33. Talking politics all day isn't engagement, it's saturation. When every conversation loops back to ideology, outrage, or the latest headline, politics stops being a civic concern and turns into an identity performance. What makes it especially exhausting is the compulsiveness. There's no off switch, no sense of proportion. Everything becomes a proxy battle. Every interaction a chance to signal allegiance or provoke reaction. Nuance dies first. Listening follows shortly after. It also flattens people. Complex human beings get reduced to positions, labels, teams. Agreement is treated as virtue, disagreement as moral failure. The point isn't understanding or problem solving, it's reinforcement. The same talking points circulate, polished and repeated, until they sound like independent thought. And the irony is that constant political chatter rarely leads to meaningful action. It creates the feeling of engagement without the substance of it. Outrage becomes a hobby. Being informed becomes indistinguishable from being perpetually angry. At its core, this isn't about caring too much. It's about caring in a way that consumes everything else. Politics matters, but when it becomes the only lens you see through, it doesn't make you more aware. It makes you narrower.